see that same Iowa. And so there's some concerns about what might happen as CRP is lost for this species, but certainly that's something we can hopefully continue to track with the breeding bird survey trends. So it's not entirely doom and gloom, and things can be done. So the impetus for this study, however, was really a lot of land managers being very concerned that, hey, we're out there, we're managing for grassland birds, we're doing things that we think should benefit, and we're just really not seeing responses. And then also realizing that we don't really have a great data set to sort of compare how grassland birds are doing on sort of public lands or private lands, or just generally what their status is across the region, other than, at a big scale of the breeding bird survey trend data. And so we undertook this study to really answer these three questions, and primarily the first two. We kind of added the last one, realizing that we had the information and it was probably a good question to ask as well. But starting out, just to try to answer the question, does ownership explain variability in bird abundance? We know that birds don't know who owns the land, but who owns the land, is important in terms of how it's managed. And so getting some handle on how bird abundance might vary based on ownership might start to tell us something about, how they're responding to things on the landscape. And then, obviously digging into that more specifically and asking the question, do management practices explain variability in bird abundance? Can we see differences in terms of time since fire or grazing, and how does that vary by species across a wide scale or a wide range of the region? And then finally, asking the question, does reconstruction history explain variability in bird abundance? A lot of times I think we hear the mantra that, or I've certainly heard it, that, species diversity, species composition of our grasslands is not important to grassland birds. It's really the structure. And I think that's probably overall true, except that composition impacts the structure. But, I think it's oftentimes used to say, well, reconstruction shouldn't matter versus remnant. But we had a pretty good data set here to try to look at that for a number of species. And so that was one of the questions we asked too. Does, a remnant prairie versus a reconstructed prairie make a difference or influence what we see in terms of abundance of grassland bird species? So one of the things that was really important in this study was our study site selection choices, because depending on the range of variability that we sampled, whether it was with ownership or, habitat characteristics or landscape characteristics, really makes a difference as to what you can extrapolate to. And so if we wanted to understand, how public lands are helping grassland birds, we needed to be able to sample the range of ownerships out there, and so be able to compare it to private lands. And so we also know that things like local habitat characteristics make a difference for grassland birds, and things like landscape characteristics. So how big is a grassland? What's the percentage of grass in the landscape? What's the percentage of trees in the landscape? There have been a number of studies to show that can be important for a number of species. And so we wanted to be able to sample across that range of variability as well. So what we did at the beginning of the study is we took essentially the cropland data layer that's available, the most recent layer, and we took anything that's categorized as grass or some type of grassland. And that's what you see here in this map. Anything that has a color is something that is classified as grass, as of, I think this was 2012. And so then what we did was we classified that remaining grassland based on a 1 mile radius around, any given pixel, looking at what's the percentage of grass and the percentage of trees in that landscape or for that site. And then we classified it and we color coded it so you can kind of see how that breaks out here. So the green colors are generally the lower percentage of trees, blue more trees, red the greatest percentage of trees, and you can clearly see that gradient from western Minnesota as you creep east towards the prairie forest border area, and the same in the southern sort of study area in Iowa there. And then the darkness of the color indicates the amount of grass or the percentage of grass in the landscape. So the areas that are the darkest green are the areas that are, you might think might be ideal for grassland birds. The most grass and the fewest trees in the landscape. And so then we took this data and we overlaid a protected lands layer, and we tried to sample as randomly as we could, a number of public lands across this area, as well as then private lands across the area as well. We identified a lot of private lands randomly, but we can only survey areas that give us permission, and so we had to do the best we could in that, and then also supplementing that with areas that landowners that did allow us permission in these landscapes to survey. And so that made sure that we sort of captured the range of variability when we were out there selecting our study sites. So the great thing about studying grassland birds and doing grassland bird work is that you get to see lots of, amazing sunrises, because these grassland birds, we went out to them and surveyed, looking at all songbird species and counting essentially all individuals within the management units that we surveyed. So we did, we walked transects, as I said, and counted individuals, did the grassland bird surveys, but we also did on-the-ground characterization of the local habitat. So looking at things like VOR, this is a rebel pole here. Some of you may be familiar with this. It basically is a way to estimate sort of a height and density of grassland, and tends to be very correlated with the amount of biomass on the ground. But also looking at things like height of the vegetation, amount of litter, cover of grass, cover of forbs. We also estimated in the field sort of distance to the nearest tree and kind of percent of tree cover at the local site, because sometimes tree cover in isolated patches doesn't show up as well in our remote sensing layers like the cropland data layer. So trying to get an on-the-ground assessment for the tree cover as well, so that we could look at the local vegetation characteristics as well as the landscape characteristics, because we know those are important for grassland birds too. So after 2 field seasons, we surveyed essentially 210 different management units. Each dot on here is a management unit that we surveyed. The green ones are the public lands, and there were 140 public management units. And the gold ones are, or yellow, depending on how it shows up on your screen, are the private lands that we surveyed. And so there were 70 different private management units that we surveyed as well. So it's not a complete half and half. Getting permission to survey private lands is certainly more challenging. But I think we did pretty well, and we got a pretty good distribution across the study region, and as it's represented by different characteristics of the landscape, and as well as management. So I think we did pretty good along those lines. And a number of those units were actually surveyed, or some of those units, I should say, I guess, were surveyed in both years. And so when we did the analysis, we stacked these. We used each management unit and year as a combination in the model. And so we essentially ended up with 298 different sort of unit year combinations. And to give you an idea of the breakdown of the management treatments and how they were represented there, so we had 38 of those were grazed at least once, oftentimes more, within the previous 3 years, and 149 of those were burned at least once in the previous 3 years, and then 104 of those were remnant prairie. And those are not mutually exclusive numbers. So, the remnant prairie ones, some of them may have been burned or grazed as well. So they don't necessarily add up to 298 there. But a pretty good breakdown and representation of our variables of interest. And I will say that we ended up using 3 years. We tried to go back a little farther than that, but really 3 years was as far back as we can go with consistent information management records for all of our sites. And so that was kind of a limitation of availability of management information in the past. So I'm not going to talk a lot about data analysis, which hopefully will make most of you happy. However, if you have questions about this, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you might have. But I do want to say just a couple of things here, just to make the results more understandable as I present them. We evaluated our models basically for 12 different species. So there were 12 species we had enough data, we felt like we had enough data for to draw conclusions about. And basically, the way we went about answering these questions is, as I said throughout, we know that habitat variables are important, and we know that landscape variables are important. So basically what we did was we said, all right, we're going to account for all of the variability that we can with those variables first, and then we're going to try to add our management and ownership type variables to see if they can explain additional variation beyond what the local and landscape characteristics are already explaining. And so that was essentially the comparison we made to determine whether or not, if land management is explaining variability beyond what these local and landscape characteristics can explain by themselves. So just to dive right into the results here, these are the results for our analysis comparing, those local and landscape characteristics to a model that also included ownership, which in this case was essentially a binary public or private variable. Was it publicly owned or was it privately owned? And I will say that there are a few things like Nature Conservancy lands, which are technically private. They got lumped in with public because there's public access and they're generally managed more of a public resource as opposed to sort of production or livestock production from a private landowner perspective. So, and this list here is the 12 species that we were able to evaluate for all of these models. And what you see this list on the left here under local and landscape, these are the 5 species in this analysis that had, basically the most support for the local and landscape variable model only. So ownership didn't seem to play any role or make any difference in terms of their abundance on public versus private lands. And so those were species like brown-headed cowbird, eastern kingbird, LeConte sparrow, Savannah sparrow, and eastern meadowlark here. But 7 species did actually have the variable ownership explain a substantial amount of variability, and there was a lot more support for a model that included that variable than just the local and landscape characteristics by themselves. And so what you can see here, the 2 species at the top, Henslow sparrow and bobolink, of these 7 species, those were the 2 that were more abundant on public lands. These other 5 species were actually significantly more abundant on private lands. So that included things like dick thistles, western meadowlarks, which, we've seen have been declining a lot, sedge wrens, clay-colored sparrows, and grasshopper sparrows as well. So this is kind of interesting. The fact that the variable ownership in and of itself could explain more variability for some of our more obligate grassland bird species, I think was intriguing. And the fact that 5 of those were more common on private lands, I think also interesting. So at the same time, you'll say, well, yeah, but these birds, right, they have no idea who owns the land. They're not saying, oh, well, I prefer to build or establish my territory on private lands. Really, there's probably something going on with the habitat difference potentially in ownership. And so that's where digging into the management variables really comes in, I think, and to give us a little more insight about what might be going on there. And so we take the same 12 species and that same base model with local landscape characteristics, and then instead of adding ownership, added variables like time since fire and grazing history. And so time since fire was, within the last 3 years or more, and then grazing history was whether or not it had been grazed in each of the the survey year or the 2 years prior, the 3-year grazing history. And so in this case, there was only 1 species that had the most support for a model that didn't include any of the management variables. But essentially, 11 of our 12 species had, substantially more support for models, or I should say the management variables could explain more variability beyond what the local and landscape characteristics were doing on their own. And so time since fire by itself in the model was the most important for these 4 species. So dick thistle, Henslow sparrow, eastern meadowlark, LeConte sparrow, time since fire was an important predictor for them. And the number here in red indicates the year at which they had the highest abundance. So for instance, LeConte sparrows in this study in our data set basically had the highest abundance 2 years post-fire. And then there were 3 species that basically had the most support for models that included grazing history by itself. So not time since fire, just the local and landscape and grazing history. So brown-headed cowbird, western meadowlark, and sedge wren were those 3 species. And the letters here denote basically if there's a G, that means it was grazed, and the number of letters is basically the year. So the number of years that we were evaluating. So brown-headed cowbird and western meadowlark were most abundant on sites that had been grazed all 3 of the previous, or the current year and the 2 previous years. And the sedge wren was most abundant on a site that was grazed in the current year, but not the previous 2 years. And then finally, there were 4 species where putting those 2 things together was by far better than either of the 2 alone. And so that was species like bobolink, grasshopper sparrow, clay-colored sparrow, and savanna sparrow. And once again, the number here is the time since fire at which they were most common or had the greatest abundance. And then the letter designation is the grazing history where they had the greatest abundance. So you can see once again in this list, it's quite interesting, I think, bobolink, grasshopper sparrow, and savanna sparrow all had their highest abundances on areas that had, basically grazed every year in the data that we had available. So moving to our last question about reconstruction results, there were 4 species in this analysis that basically reconstruction history did not explain any additional variability. Eastern kingbird, eastern meadowlark, Henslow sparrow, and LeConte sparrow. But 8 of the species, reconstruction history did explain additional variability. And in only 1 instance were they more common on restored or reconstructed, however you want to say that. Essentially, I guess, to be consistent, it should say reconstructed there by Dick Sissel, too. Dick Sissel was the only one that was more abundant on reconstructed prairies, which is maybe not surprising if any of you know something about Dick Sissel. But what is kind of interesting to me is that a number of these species did actually have higher abundances on remnant prairie, which I think, just sort of speaks to the importance of our protection and our efforts to maintain remnant prairies on the landscape. So in conclusion, I guess, I think for me, these are some of the main take-home points anyway. Private lands, I think these results are somewhat encouraging because private lands are by far where most of our remaining grasslands exist. And so knowing that some of these species, are out there, at least on these private lands and in fairly decent abundances in some cases, and they're important for a number of our grassland bird species. And so I think that's a hopeful result, a takeaway from this. But one of the other things is that, I think grazing is likely an important process for these species, particularly in this region. I mean, I guess I can't say particularly in this region, but certainly from the results in this region. Grazing was important for a number of species in terms of creating better habitat potentially, or at least habitat that fostered higher abundance of these species. For a number of our species like, bobolinks and meadowlarks and grasshopper sparrows that are all seeing pretty dramatic declines. And then finally, I think, native prairie is important to protect and maintain, but also I think it speaks to maybe digging into the question a little bit more and asking, so what's going on there with the difference between remnant and restored prairies? And is there something that we're missing in our reconstructions that we could potentially be doing better for our grassland birds to make them more suitable for some of our grassland bird species? And I think there's a lot of questions to be dug into there. And some of those questions could potentially be answered with this data set. We did collect information about, some of the species richness on the ground and looking at species diversity and, potentially going back and trying to get information about seed mixes as well. So anyway, those are some of the take-home points from me. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my funding sources. So the Fish and Wildlife Service provided the bulk of the funds for this study, but the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources was also a really important player. They really helped fund the work in southern and southwestern Minnesota in particular. And so without those 2 funding sources, this project certainly couldn't have been what it was. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that we have if we have time. Jessica?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of time. Looks like Phil has a question about how old the reconstructions were.
It was a range, and I did not, so that, what went into the model was reconstructed or remnant in terms of this analysis, but when we collected the information from the managers, we collected like what the date of reconstruction. So that's certainly something that could be looked at. None of these were brand new reconstructions. Most of them were fairly established, but that wasn't part of the analysis.
So I have a question. You talked about it a little bit, but do you have plans to mine the data to try to understand what some of the habitat variables might be that different birds are responding to between, say, private and public land? Or there's all sorts of interactions you can think of here, right? They kind of never ending. But
yeah,
I guess,
and in terms of local, like local habitat characteristics, and Lisa Elliott, who I think is on the phone here, or on the line somewhere, she and Doug recently had a publication come out. So they did look at some of like the habitat associations for a number of these grassland birds in the southwestern part of Minnesota. That was her master's degree project, and I think actually, Jessica, you've sent that publication around. So. So they've done a little bit of that already, but yeah, in terms of looking at habitat in relation to the management variables, I think there's a lot to dig into there. And I would say yes, I do. I would love to do that. Have I carved out time in my schedule? Yes.
yeah, it's there. Yeah,
it is there, and I think there is a lot to be learned. So I actually we're in the process of just submitting the first manuscript this week, but I think there's a lot more. Dig out of it.
Yeah. So Mary Beth wants to know if you considered looking at haying.
We did, and I did ask that question, but in the end, I had such inconsistent information about it across all sites that I really didn't feel confident asking that in a broad sense across the study region. But I do think that. And so all that information is recorded in my database, all of the management information that we collected and how it's associated with the sites, including the haying information. So you could pull out the sites that have information on haying and start to look at that more specifically, but I just didn't have consistently across the study region information about whether it happened and when it happened, and to be confident in a big scale analysis of haying.
Sure. Oh, Kristen wants to know, was survivorship considered?
No. So we did not look at nest success. We did not look at, survivorship, or we didn't abandon the individuals for sites that we, surveyed twice to see if any individuals return. And that's a big, so we can only talk about how these things affected abundance. And we can't say, what their success was like in these areas. So, that is a limitation. I would say that's the next step for some of these things, particularly maybe as it relates to grazing, or even the difference between remnants and reconstructed prairies, to see if there's a difference there too. Even if they're more abundant, maybe they're doing better on restored prairies where they are there. It's a good question. It's just that we were going for scope here, so a lot of different sites across a wide range. And nest success and survivorship data is very intense information. And so, I think that's kind of like a next smaller scale step for some of this.
Any other questions today? I don't see anything else coming in right now, but I'm sure y'all can find Marissa, and if you have additional follow-up questions, contact her individually, or some of her co-authors as well. So if there are no other lingering immediate questions, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Marissa. That was really great. Oh, Phil. Phil coming in with a last-minute question. How does migration factor? 1 year, they're here, and more abundance, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and that's always the question with migratory birds. I would say that in general, like in my experience where I've banded birds and looked from year to year, in sort of the heart of species range where they're sort of consistently there, you know, it's different individuals oftentimes every year, but the same territories are often occupied. Of course, depending on lots of variability at the site, you know, in terms of disturbance or other sorts of factors, whether the prairie's even there or not. But I do think it's probably a bigger factor for species like potentially dick thistles, which tend to be kind of eruptive in this part of the world, where, you know, factors in other parts of their ranges may play a role in how many dick thistles we see this year, more so than whether or not you grazed a site this year or something. So I think on a species-by-species basis that the migration factor is going to play a different role. But it's always something you have to consider too, just as a caveat to any study you do on these species up here.
Okay. Well, thanks, Marissa. That was really great to get an update on that project. And next week we have more bird stuff with Kristen Hall from Audubon to discuss marsh bird monitoring with applications for wetland habitat management in the prairie landscape. And thanks to everybody that joined today. We'll have the link to the YouTube recording to share in a couple weeks. Thanks a lot.